If you're someone who consumes a significant amount of information on a daily basis, you're probably always looking for those
Yeah.
underlying patterns.
Right, the aha moments.
Exactly. Those moments where a tangled web of data just suddenly untangles itself, and it reveals this broader structural truth about how the world actually operates.
Hmm.
And that is exactly our objective for today's deep dive. We are going to look at a seemingly boring, uh, mundane, bureaucratic log that unexpectedly delivers an absolute masterclass in how human institutions handle radical technological shifts.
It really does.
Specifically, we're diving into a translated set of recorded observations from Tsutomu Yoshida, also known as Tom Yoshida, from his note series, which is titled AI as a Transitional Phase.
And it is just a remarkable text, primarily because of the analytical distance Yoshida manages to maintain throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, he really steps back from it all.
He does. But before we get into the mechanics of his actual argument, I think it's important we establish some ground rules for how he approaches this material.
Yeah?
Because this deep dive today, it is not a technical evaluation of artificial intelligence. We aren't going to sit here and debate the parameters of large language models.
Right, no coding tutorials today.
Right, no tech specs, and we aren't trying to reach these neat, tidy, definitive conclusions about the future of work. Yoshida's methodology is entirely observational,
Almost like an anthropologist.
exactly like an anthropologist. His mission, and the mission for us today, is to just sit comfortably with unfinished thoughts. We are exploring paused questions.
I love that phrase, paused questions.
Because his premise is that we are currently navigating a transitional phase. And during these periods, the goal shouldn't be to rush to finalize our thinking. It should be to carefully observe the shift as it's unfolding in real time.
Which, that observational stance requires a pretty high tolerance for ambiguity from the reader.
Yeah.
And there's a specific caveat regarding the source material that perfectly illustrates what you're talking about.
The translation note.
Yes. So Yoshida's work is translated from Japanese, and he explicitly puts in a note saying that some of the resulting English phrasing might feel slightly halting or abstract, or even a little uncomfortable to read.
Yeah.
But he intentionally preserves that discomfort. He didn't let the translators smooth it out.
He didn't, and it is a highly deliberate methodological choice on his part. He retains that slight linguistic friction to mirror the real-world friction that happens when a deeply established culture violently collides with a new technology.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. Because when translations are smoothed over too perfectly, they often erase the subtle hesitations, the structural misalignments that actually define periods of profound change.
They make it look too easy.
Exactly. So for you listening, if a concept we brought up today feels slightly abstract, lean into it. That structural friction is precisely what he is trying to document.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the core anecdote Yoshida uses to anchor his entire theory. Because to understand his perspective on artificial intelligence, he starts with a scenario that has absolutely nothing to do with neural networks.
Nothing at all.
We are looking at a procedural discussion within the Japanese National Parliament, and the topic of debate was whether or not digital tablets like iPads should be permitted inside the legislative chambers.
Which sounds incredibly dry.
Right. On the surface, this reads like a completely standard, boring organizational debate about digitalization. It's the classic tension between modern efficiency and legacy tradition. You've got arguments over paper versus screens, cybersecurity issues, procedural rules clashing with hardware.
It's the exact same conversation that has taken place in corporate boardrooms and legacy institutions globally over the past decade.
Every single one of them.
But Yoshida highlights that the specific parliamentary debate did not remain focused on practical efficiency. The conversation regarding, battery life and information access and network security, it was entirely derailed.
The discussion just hit an absolute bottleneck. A specific word was introduced into the debate that brought the entire procedural machinery to a grinding halt. And that word was dignity.
Dignity.
Yes, a member of the parliament argued that the physical presence and the use of a digital tablet might inherently compromise the dignity of the parliament itself.
What's fascinating here is the functional power of that specific word in a crowded room. Yoshida is explicitly clear that he has zero interest in debating the actual validity of the claim.
He doesn't care if a tablet is
He
dignified.
doesn't care at all whether an iPad is objectively dignified or undignified. What captivates him is how the word dignity operates as an evaluative signal.
An evaluative signal.
Yes, because evaluative signals are entirely unmeasurable. You cannot quantify dignity. You can't put it on a spreadsheet or chart it on a graph or point to some universally agreed upon legal definition of it.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment here,
Right.
because I know what you're thinking at home.
Mm.
Isn't an unmeasurable word like dignity just a incredibly convenient smokescreen?
Oh, absolutely. That's the first thought.
Right. Are we just looking at older parliament members who are uncomfortable with a new user interface, and instead of just admitting they don't want to learn how to swipe through a PDF, they hide behind this grandiose term to kill the initiative?
It is a highly common assumption, and a fair one, but Yoshida argues that the underlying intent actually doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter if they're lying.
Whether it is a smokescreen to hide technological incompetence or a deeply held traditionalist belief, the functional result is identical. The discussion stops.
It just dies right there.
Right. When an evaluative signal like dignity or appropriateness is deployed in a highly formal setting, there's this immediate, unspoken assumption that the meaning of the word is already universally shared by the room.
Oh, I see.
If a senior member stands up and states, "This lacks dignity," they are not required to provide supporting data. And more importantly, you cannot argue data against a feeling.
You can't say, well, actually, this tablet has 50% more dignity than a binder.
Exactly. The machinery of institutional change just pauses because the metrics for debate have suddenly vanished.
It creates a state of total paralysis, which leads directly into Yoshida's analysis of how legacy institutions are actually governed on a day-to-day basis. Because if a single unmeasurable word has that much stopping power, it requires us to look at the underlying architecture of institutional rules.
And Yoshida categorizes this institutional governance into two distinct tiers. The first tier consists of codified rules, the laws.
The stuff written in the books.
Right. These are explicit, written down, debated, formally voted upon, and entered into an official ledger. But the second tier is what he terms accumulated practice.
Accumulated practice.
These are the ghost rules.
I love that term. Ghost rules.
They're the unspoken agreements, the inherited habits, the environmental customs that have simply perpetuated themselves over decades or even centuries. No one ever drafted a bill to enact them. They simply represent the way things are done.
And the trap lies entirely within that accumulated practice. If an obstacle to technology is codified in law, for instance, let's say there's a statute stating all official documents must be submitted in triplicate on physical paper.
Very common.
Right. If that's the case, there is a defined, visible, procedural path to amend it. You draft a revision, you debate the merits, and you hold a vote.
It's tedious, but the path exists.
Exactly. But if the obstacle is a ghost rule, if it is merely an accumulated practice dictating that screens lack the requisite vibe for a legislative chamber, the path to change is completely invisible. You cannot draft a motion to repeal a custom.
You can't vote away a feeling. Which brings us to the core paralysis of the transitional phase. When the pathway to change is invisible, the accountability for that change becomes completely diffused.
Diffused how?
Well, in a system governed purely by written law, it is clear who holds the authority to amend it. You know exactly who the lawmakers are, but with accumulated practice, responsibility is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Yoshida poses a really critical question here. When the introduction of tablets or AI is halted by an appeal to dignity, who exactly is stopping it? Is there a specific individual actively blocking the technology?
And the reality is that there usually isn't a singular villain standing at the gates actively blocking them. The institution is simply frozen by its own historical momentum.
Exactly.
The weight of that custom is immense. And because the responsibility to challenge it is so scattered, the proposed technological change just quietly stars in the middle of the room.
We see this constantly in modern corporate environments too, not just government.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the classic ghost rule of the modern meeting. If you bring a leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen to a boardroom, you're instantly perceived as engaged and serious.
Very professional.
Right. But if you bring a laptop to take the exact same notes, you are perceived as distracted or disengaged, like you're checking your emails. No one ever wrote that rule down in the employee handbook, but it actively dictates professional behavior.
That is the perfect modern equivalent. It perfectly highlights the invisible weight of custom. And it transitions us right into Yoshida's most profound observation in this whole series.
Yes, this is the turning point.
He moves away from the abstract concept of rules entirely, and he focuses on the physical reality of the human body in a professional space. He examines what he calls the choreography of work.
Here's where it gets really interesting, especially as we start mapping this onto artificial intelligence. Yoshida draws this incredibly sharp contrast between the physicality of paper and the physicality of glass. Consider the physical choreography of interacting with a massive paper legislative binder. You are audibly rustling pages. You're physically moving your arms to flip these thick sections, maybe licking your thumb to turn a page, distinctly shifting your weight from one side of a desk to another.
You're putting on a show.
Yes, to anyone observing you from across the chamber, turning those pages visibly and audibly registers as labor.
Now contrast that physical performance with operating a tablet. You could be reading the exact same legislative brief. You could be analyzing the exact same data, performing the exact same cognitive labor. However, physically you are sitting completely still.
Barely moving.
You are silently swiping a frictionless piece of glass with a single finger. Outwardly, the performance of labor has disappeared. It looks fundamentally different to the room.
It is the performativity of effort. We have built centuries, literally centuries, of institutional heuristics around the idea that visible physical friction equates to seriousness, dedication, and value.
Right.
If a task does not appear physically demanding, our accumulated practice tells us it must not be important.
Exactly. This is the psychology of efficiency. Efficiency, by definition, optimizes and reduces physical movement. But that very reduction in friction creates a deep psychological discomfort in observers who have been conditioned to evaluate worth based on visible effort.
It feels wrong to them.
It does. If a politician is frantically tearing through a physical binder, they look like a dedicated public servant. If they are silently scrolling on a screen, the visual heuristic fails. They look like they might be browsing social media regardless of the actual cognitive work occurring.
So Yoshida's thesis is that the tension in the parliament, this sudden invocation of the word dignity, has absolutely nothing to do with the tablet as a technological tool.
Nothing.
It is entirely a reaction to how human behavior appears to others when technology fundamentally alters the natural rhythm of the body. The institution simply does not have a framework to evaluate this frictionless rhythm yet. And this is where the implications for artificial intelligence become incredibly stark.
This is the absolute crux of why Yoshida uses the specific anecdote to discuss AI. If a tablet reduces the friction of work to a single finger swipe, artificial intelligence threatens to reduce the friction of complex cognitive tasks to a single static prompt.
Just hitting enter.
Yes. How does an institution evaluate the dignity or the value of an employee who can generate an 80-page analytical report in 4 seconds without moving their hands? The visible choreography of work is entirely eradicated.
It completely breaks the institutional heuristics. If our ghost rules demand that work must look like work, AI makes work look like absolute leisure, and that creates massive systemic anxiety.
It's terrifying for these legacy systems.
But Yoshida also points out that these legacy institutions are not uniform monoliths. The parliament is a highly fragmented ecosystem, much like any large corporation you might work in. You have specialized technology committees, and then you have grand ceremonial chambers.
And that non-uniformity is critical to understand. The digital tablet or the AI software is a perfectly identical tool regardless of where it is deployed, but the specific environment radically alters how that tool is perceived.
The room dictates the reaction.
Exactly. In a fast-paced technology committee, a tablet is viewed as an essential mechanism for data retrieval. It's welcomed. But carry that exact same piece of glass and aluminum into a chamber steeped in historical ceremony, and it suddenly triggers a crisis of dignity.
Because the underlying unspoken concerns of those specific environments are wildly different. Yoshida notes that the word dignity is often a catch-all term that masks a dozen different, highly specific anxieties.
It's a shield.
Right. For instance, there is the anxiety regarding fairness of access. What happens to the institutional hierarchy if a junior member can instantly retrieve data on a tablet, bypassing the senior member's decades of memorized knowledge?
Power dynamics shift instantly.
Exactly. Then there is the anxiety regarding official records. Does a digital amendment carry the same historical weight as a physically stamped document?
That's a huge one for legal bodies.
And there is the anxiety of maintaining order. How does a chairperson maintain authority if they cannot visually confirm what their members are focusing on behind their screens?
When you introduce a frictionless medium for information, you introduce an entirely new taxonomy of fears. And Yoshida's key insight here is that if these underlying disparate anxieties are not perfectly resolved and aligned across the various factions of an institution, the process of change simply pauses.
It just stops.
It's essential to recognize that the technology is not necessarily facing outright rejection. It is that the environmental conditions required for institutional consensus have not fully matured.
It enters a state of indefinite suspension. The debate doesn't end with a definitive rejection. It stalls with a hesitant, not yet.
Yes, not yet.
Which leads us to Yoshida's overarching philosophy regarding the dual nature of custom within these massive systems. We often fall into the trap of assuming that legacy institutions, governments, international corporations, legal bodies are rigid, permanent structures that resist change simply because they are stubborn.
We just think they're old and slow.
Right, but Yoshida argues that institutions maintain long-term stability for two completely opposing reasons. Sometimes an institution remains stable because it is highly functional, agile, and perfectly calibrated to its purpose.
But more often, and this is the critical point, an institution remains heavily reliant on custom because it is incredibly fragile.
Fragile.
Yes. If the internal mechanics of a system are so delicate that a slight shift in how information is accessed could disrupt the entire hierarchy, that system will instinctively deploy every unmeasurable word at its disposal to resist the disruption.
So custom acts as the armor for that fragility. It guarantees continuity. By strictly enforcing accumulated practice, the institution ensures that the parliament of today physically resembles the parliament of a century ago, which projects this necessary illusion of unwavering stability to the public.
It's a necessary illusion.
But while that armor acts as a vital shock absorber for the society it serves, it inherently generates immense paralyzing friction the moment a new technology attempts to take root.
And returning to Yoshida's methodological ground rules from the beginning of our discussion, his objective is not to solve that friction.
Right. He's not a consultant fixing the problem.
Exactly. He is not offering a blueprint for how to forcefully integrate AI into legacy systems. He is asking us to become hyper-aware of the exact moment the friction halts the machine and to examine the language used to justify the pause.
So what does this all mean for you? For you, the listener, as you navigate this transitional phase in your own professional landscape? If we synthesize the core arguments from Yoshida's notes, the overarching takeaway is that the technological object itself is almost always a decoy.
Always.
The tablet in the Japanese parliament was never the actual issue. It was merely the catalyst that exposed the fragile architecture of the room. The real focus of Yoshida's work and the analytical lens he wants us to apply to this current wave of artificial intelligence is the exact point where institutional dialogue stops.
That point of friction.
Yes. He challenges us to look closely at where progress pauses and to identify the single, unmeasurable word that quietly derails the momentum of an entire room.
It requires a fundamental shift in how we analyze technological resistance. Instead of aggressively debating the capabilities of the hardware or the AI model, we should be analyzing the evaluative signals and ghost rules that are halting the integration.
The ghost rules are the real barrier.
They are. And building on Yoshida's profound observation regarding the performativity of labor and the choreography of work, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we move deeper into this transitional era.
Please do.
We spent significant time discussing how the physical act of flipping paper pages proves to an observer that you are actively working, and how the frictionless tap of a glass screen generates institutional discomfort because it requires vastly less visible physical effort.
Right.
If we map that dynamic directly onto our current trajectory with artificial intelligence, we have to ask, what happens to our societal perception of human value when AI eventually allows us to execute highly complex cognitive and analytical tasks with zero physical movement whatsoever?
That is the big question.
When you can draft comprehensive legislation, structure a massive financial report, or analyze a dense data set without so much as moving your hands across a keyboard, how will you prove your dignity to the room? Ultimately, how will you prove your professional worth when the physical rhythm of your body is completely, permanently removed from the choreography of your work?
That is a staggering question, and it is exactly the kind of unfinished thought Yoshida wants us to sit with. As you navigate your own professional environments this week, I highly encourage you to look out for those unmeasurable words. Watch for the moments when a logical discussion about a new tool suddenly hits a brick wall, and ask yourself what invisible ghost rules are actually dictating the terms of engagement. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, for taking the time to explore these complex structural transitions, and for sitting with the friction.